After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
What's the most extra thing you've ever done for your birthday? I bet it's not as extra as throwing yourself a $45 million military parade. Welcome to After America. I'm Emma Shortis. While he would never admit it, President Donald Trump's attempt to showcase America's military might was a fizzer. As many on the ground pointed out, the streets of DC were quieter than they usually are on a normal summer weekend. Even Trump's most loyal acolytes had trouble disguising their boredom. That's one of the most confounding things about Trump. He is simultaneously ridiculous and embarrassing, and a threat to the very fabric of American democracy. As Trump was struggling to enjoy his military parade, Marines were on the streets of Los Angeles, deployed there to quell Democratic dissent. Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, had a press conference in which she said that the administration was going to liberate California from its democratically elected leadership.
We are not going away. We are staying here to liberate this city from the socialist and the burdensome leadership that this governor and that this mayor have placed on this country.
A few days later, Trump announced on social media that ICE's mandate was being expanded and would target, in his words, the core of the Democratic power centre in cities like New York, Los Angeles and Chicago. Australians are already well aware of the threat the Trump administration poses to global peace and security. Our feelings about our relationship with the United States are changing, and they're changing quickly. But that change isn't reflected, at least not publicly, by either the Australian government or our foreign policy commentariat.
Well, Kieran, we've known about the review for some time. We welcome it and we will engage with it. It's a very natural step for the incoming administration to take.
Even as the Trump administration announced that it would put the AUKUS submarine deal to a review, and despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, the national security establishment is insisting that everything is just fine, actually. Trump's America will deliver. But it's not, and it won't. Someone who has been vocal about the failings of AUKUS is former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who joins us on the show today. Malcolm and I talked about how AUKUS requires Australia to sacrifice our sovereignty for our security, but that the nature of the deal means that we might end up with neither. And as the current Prime Minister heads to his first meeting with the President on the sidelines of the G7 in Canada, we spoke about what the best outcome of that meeting could possibly be. Here's Malcolm now. Malcolm, thank you so much for coming back on the show when I know you've been in such high demand already this week.
Thank you. Well, very kind. Thank you. Good to be with you, Emma.
Thank you again. Malcolm, of course, there has been an avalanche of news over the weekend, even by the standards of Trump world. We've had news about AUKUS, which of course we'll get into, but of course LA as well, Israel's attack on Iran, Ukraine is ongoing, as is the disaster being inflicted on Gazans. President Joe Biden used to like to say that America and the world were facing what he described as an inflection point. And intuitively, it does feel like we're in the middle of some kind of giant historical break. How much of that do you think is down to the Trump administration? How much more dangerous has this president made the world?
Well, look, this is a very different president, and you can't really say that we share values with Donald Trump's administration the same way we did with Joe Biden's, or in fact, pretty much all of Biden's predecessors, with the exception of Trump Mark I, of course. So, Trump is avowedly transactional. It's America first. He wants to use American power and influence to advantage America at the expense of others, whether it's through trade deals or other leverage. And so that is a very different world. I mean, who would have imagined an American president would humiliate the heroic Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office and blame Ukraine for starting the war with Russia.
Mm.
You know, these are very wild times, and we just have to recognise we're dealing with a different reality in Washington than what we were used to. And yes, I think all of that has made the world more unpredictable and therefore more dangerous, because the less predictable and the less steady global relations are, the more there is the risk of an accident, of somebody doing something, you know, even perhaps unintentionally, that triggers a chain of events that lead to a massive conflict.
I think that's true. And I think Trump does make that perhaps more likely.
Well, it's not. There's no perhaps about it. I think it's clear. You know, I mean, we're being polite here, but I mean, really, I mean, who would did we ever imagine we'd have an American president who would threaten to annex Canada or seize Greenland? You know, these are very wild times.
Yeah, wild is the word. And I think you're very right to point out that Trump is upending traditional alliances. You know, it is extraordinary to have a president literally threatening to invade one of its closest allies. And, you know, apparently to the great surprise of many people here, Australia is not immune to that, to Trump's approach to alliances.
Well, thank
Last
heaven
week,
he hasn't threatened to invade us, but
well, not yet. Anyway, we'll see how this meeting goes. Last week, the administration announced that it was going to put the AUKUS submarine deal to a review to make sure it fits Trump's America First agenda. Do you think that means the whole thing is done for?
well, I don't think the whole thing is done for. I mean, I think the big issue for the Americans in the AUKUS deal is the provision of Virginia-class submarines to Australia. I mean, everything else about it, it seems to me, looks fabulous. I mean, we are giving them $3 billion with no right of return if we don't get any subs. We are providing them with a submarine base in Western Australia and a dockyard to maintain and support their submarines. So we're doing all that for them. And our best and brightest young sailors are training to work on nuclear submarines, and some of them are actually serving on American submarines now. So that's, you know, that yes, they are sharing their nuclear technology with the UK, and we are going to, at some point in the 2040s, get apparently nuclear-powered submarines built with the UK. It's a long way off, and people are pretty sceptical about whether it can be realised in that time frame. But you know, so it's a fabulous deal for the Americans. That's why I say it's a bad deal for Australia. I'm not being critical of America here. I'm just saying our government did a terrible deal for Australia. They negotiated a thoroughly asymmetric deal where the Americans get a whole lot of goodies, and, you know, they would say that we benefit from them having a base in Western Australia. So let's say some of that benefits us. But in terms of the key deliverable, the Virginia-class submarines, which we are supposed to start receiving from the Americans in 2032, they have no obligation to deliver them to us unless the president certifies that their Navy doesn't need them, essentially, that the transfer would not degrade their undersea capabilities. And as we know, they are about 20 submarines short of what they believe they need. They are producing about 1.1, 1.2 a year. They need to be producing at least 2 a year in order to replace retirements. So, you know, from the Americans' point of view, they're entitled to say, look, you signed up to this deal. You knew that we were struggling to produce enough submarines. We haven't been able to increase our production sufficient to meet our needs and yours, so you dip out. And that's a risk you Australians took, and we did. And so they're not. So I think that, you know, and then there's AUKUS Pillar 2, which, as you know, is the cooperation on technologies, AI, robotics, various other things. I mean, there's not a lot of action there, to be honest. I don't think any of the three countries are spending much on it. So AUKUS Pillar 2 at this stage is, I wouldn't say it's a failure, but there's not a lot to show for it.
Are you satisfied? Are you confident that President Trump is on board for AUKUS?
I've never had concerns about this, and I've never had any reason to. I know there's been lots of speculation about it, and a lot of self-fulfilling speculation about it, or at least seeking to be self-fulfilling. But that hasn't been my concern.
If we go back to Pillar 1 and particularly the Virginia-class submarines, I think there's always been an argument that any administration, not just a Trump administration, but wouldn't see it in the United States' interests, exactly as you said, to hand over those submarines, which are some of the crown jewels in the United States Navy. You know, why would it be in the United States' interest to hand them over?
Well, that's what I say, Emma. I mean, you could have the most pro-Australian president you could imagine. You could have a mantelpiece with, you know, koala bears and wombats on it. But at the end of the day, the president has got a clear legislative and political duty to put the US Navy first. And we knew that. So you know, and we also know that the British project is more likely than not going to run very late and over budget. Most of these projects do. So it was a terrible decision. I mean, what Morrison did was threw away a submarine program that would have delivered a submarine. So we were building; they're under our control. They would have, you know, had the first one in the water in about 2032, and then another, you know, one every 12 or 18 months thereafter. But at least we were in charge of it. We were commanders of our own destiny, if you like. Here, we are utterly at the whim of American presidents, American industry, let alone what's happening in Britain. So it's a terrible sacrifice of agency and sovereignty.
It absolutely is. Do you think there's a possibility that this review will come back with an alternative to the Virginia class part of the program, that it might come back with some kind of quid pro quo or a revision of that part, but continue on with the rest of the deal, which, you know, as you described it, is pretty beneficial to the Americans?
Well, firstly, I think the Americans definitely would want to continue with the rest of the deal. I'd be amazed if they didn't. As far as the submarines are concerned, the American perspective is it was the Australian government that decided to tear up the contract with France and enter into a deal with Britain to build a new class of nuclear-powered submarines, SSNs, to be, you know, delivered sometime in the early 2040s. And the Australian government did that knowing that those projects often run very late. And so that was Australia's decision. This created the capability gap between the retirement of the Collins class, which will begin towards the end of this decade and shortly thereafter, and the arrival of the new boats of Britain. So the Americans would say, and I think it's fair to say, they helpfully said, well, if we can spare some Virginias, you can have them. But the reality is they've not been able to increase their rate of production. They've tried. It's certainly been their policy. 2.5 years ago, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Chief of Navy, said that they were going to, by last year, 2024, they would be producing 1.5, average rate of production of 1.5 Virginias a year. Well, as of March this year, the rate is 1.1. So they haven't been able to get their production rates up. And I'm not suggesting they haven't tried, but they haven't. And that's why you've got that conditionality in the legislation. So what could the Americans offer us? Well, there is an argument that, we could decide that we wanted to acquire submarines somewhere else. That's a decision for Australia to make. I think what the Americans would like us to do is to not worry about the submarines, but instead buy other long-range strike capabilities like long-range missiles, drones, B-21 bombers, which would not do quite the same job as a submarine, but they would enable us to, defend Australia at a distance, and that essentially leave the submarining to the Americans. So that's an option that's canvassed in the Congressional Research Service's big report on AUKUS, which I'm sure many of our listeners have read.
And none of this is new, is it?
No. This is all of this has been perfectly obvious, but for quite a long time, I feel, and you no doubt feel at the Australia Institute, that there have only been a few lonely voices pointing out the reality, and yet you've got from Canberra and much of the media these sort of glassy-eyed assurances that everything will be okay, stay the course, don't question AUKUS, you don't need to have a plan B. How incredible. Can you imagine that? I mean, you enter into a deal with the United States where it is a part of the deal. It's actually written down, it's in legislation, that there is a circumstance where you will not get the submarines you think you're getting. Where it's at, that is part. It's a risk Australia is taking on. And when you say to the Australian government, okay, what happens if, in fact, you don't get any submarines? What's your plan B? They just say, there's no need for plan B. So that means if plan A doesn't work and we have no control over whether it does, we end up with a big fat nothing. Now, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. And so hopefully the penny will start to drop. The Americans might just say, look, we'll just wait till 2031. And the Australians could just string themselves along, keep giving the same assurances and hoping that everyone doing that will hope that they're retired and out of Parliament by the time reality hits. I'm sorry to be sounding cynical, but I do think this has been a massive failure of public policy.
I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it's cynical at all. And I would argue that part of the reason that Australia is in this position in the first place is because of the lack of genuine debate and democratic accountability in foreign and security policy more generally in Australia that you've just outlined. I think I hope you don't mind me framing it this way, but, we're in a situation where your position is framed as the radical one, that your position is radical when it comes to security policy.
I know. Isn't it amazing? You're a dangerous radical if you say, a contemplated risk that's part of the agreement. Surely we should have a plan as to what we're going to do if that risk happens. That's literally, I mean, it's incredible. But anyway, but you're right, this is one of the problems. Because it has been a bipartisan policy, both sides of Parliament have been committed to the same denial of reality and risk and failure to provide for risk. And you've got the media, for the most part, has just gone along with that. And, it may be the best thing that the US review could do is just say to the Australians, look, you please understand this, that if we cannot dramatically increase, as in more than double, our rate of production of submarines, there is no way that we can responsibly provide you with any. And, this is not like a software application. These are submarines that take 7 years to build. It's enormously expensive, complicated, labour intensive. The chances of doubling production rates in that way, in that short time frame, between now and 2028 or 2030, is very, very low. And so at some point, everyone has to get mugged by reality.
I think we should take this as an opportunity to actually do a review ourselves. I think that is long overdue. I don't think the major parties have really made the case to the Australian people that we are guaranteed to receive this capability.
And the genius in defence haven't negotiated any refund of your money out there, of your money, if they don't come through their commitment. How much of a dud is this deal? How much of a dud?
So we have a situation where we've committed to probably as much as $400 billion in defence spending. And that's $400 billion, let's remember, that we won't be able to spend on health, on dental care, on aged care or childcare or education, or lots of the other things that Australians prioritise.
I think it is time we seriously reflected upon our increasingly subservient military arrangements, our relationship with the United States, because we don't seem to be sharing core values.
Do you think there is a possibility that both, we might be mugged by reality, as you say, and have a more vibrant and democratic discussion about Australian foreign policy in this country. I'm thinking about, for example, the letter that the crossbench just wrote to the Deputy Prime Minister calling for a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. Do you think there's a possibility for an opening up of that discussion?
Well, there's a possibility, but the government, I mean, as you know, I was frustrated enough by the lack of proper public debate and discourse about this that I held a conference in Canberra on the 31st of March, and we spent a whole day talking about a whole range of issues, including AUKUS, which is basically saying, well, how does Australia manage its foreign policy and defence policy in this changed world, this changed might is right world that follows on from the second coming of Donald Trump. And, that was a good day, and I think it was some very, very good discussions. But they're just the Australian Parliament to date has been so lacking in curiosity. We have more at stake in AUKUS than either the British Parliament or the American Congress. And yet both of those parliaments are so much better informed through their own, government accountability processes. And, of course, are having inquiries. The UK Parliament's conducting an inquiry. The Defence Department is conducting a review. The work of the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, that provides you with vastly more information about AUKUS than anything you'd get here. And yet, Richard Marles says he's going to have planning to have input into the American review of AUKUS, but he doesn't want to have any review of AUKUS in Australia. Now, surely accountability should rest with our Parliament.
You would think so.
Yeah.
And look, hopefully some of that democratic accountability is coming. But I think exactly as you say, part of the reason it hasn't is because of that bipartisan consensus. And also I think because the weight of the bureaucracy around foreign policy is so oriented towards centralising the alliance as it was, and adjusting to a new reality. I think we can underestimate how difficult that will be for a locked-in bipartisan consensus. But it does seem to be shifting, even if that shift is being forced from the outside.
Yeah, I think it's definitely coming from the outside. I mean, it would have been very easy for the government to just to tell the truth and just say, look, we've done this deal, with the British. It could run late, and there would very likely would therefore be a capability gap. We don't have a lot of options as to how to fill that, but the Americans have kindly said they could sell us some Virginia-class submarines if they can spare them, but, their demands on their Navy are very intense. Their production rate is still low, although they're trying to increase it. So there is a risk that we may end up with no Virginias. That's a risk we're taking on. And that would have been the honest thing to say. And then people would have said, okay, wow, that's a hell of a thing to do, but all right, you've decided to do that. What are you going to do if you don't get any subs? And then they'd have to say, we're going to do this or that. But instead, you've just had this assurance that that everything is going to work in some kind of miraculous way. I mean, I thought it was only Scott Morrison that believed in miracles. I guess he was the original, AUKUS architect, as he likes to describe himself. But, Labor had every opportunity to carefully consider this and recraft it and do something else, but they just swallowed it, hook, line and sinker, and now they're caught. But it's never too late to be frank about it. And the question that Richard Marles and Albanese, none of them have answered the very simple question, what will you do if we do not get any Virginias? They have never been they've by and large, the brilliant press gallery of Australia is almost incapable of managing to persistently ask that question. And they've certainly, on the occasions it has been asked, they fob it off. But that is the key issue, right? And it's not an answer to say, oh, we will get them, or they will dramatically increase production rates. You've got to, there is, as long as there is a substantial risk, and I would say it's, high probability that the Americans won't be able to spare any submarines, we've got to be able to answer it. And, even if Donald Trump were to say today, oh, I'm confident that we'll get production rates up, you'll be fine, giving Albo a pat on the back, that doesn't help him. That doesn't help Albanese, because at the time when the decision will be taken is just before the submarines will be transferred. And that won't be till 2031. But if it's becoming obvious that decision is not going to go the right way for us, we've got to start getting a plan B into place. And we should have been doing that several years ago.
I think it's really important that you've mentioned, even if Trump says this during the meeting, because we know that, exactly as you said, even if Trump says, yes, we're confident that production rates will increase, or yes, I'm 100% behind AUKUS, that doesn't actually matter, because it's entirely possible that he'll turn around within half an hour and say something completely different.
Well, that's right. And you see, he can comply with AUKUS. I mean, if the Americans did not deliver those submarines, that is not a breach of AUKUS. That's part of the deal. That's a risk we assumed.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's not. We're not being, double crossed or reneged on or anything like that.
No, and I guess maybe speaking of risk, the Prime Minister is meeting with Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G7 not long after this episode of the podcast will be released, and he will take with him all of that framing that you were describing around the Australian mainstream media's approach to AUKUS and foreign policy more generally. But there's more at stake than just AUKUS for Australia and for the world. What do you think is the best possible outcome from that meeting between the Prime Minister and President Trump?
Well, I don't know what the best possible outcome is, but I mean, the worst possible outcome would be some blazing row or, some kind of humiliating excoriation in front of the press. But I'm sure that won't happen. Look, I think as long as the meeting is civil and constructive, it'd be good. I mean, it'd be great if Albo could achieve a reduction in the tariffs. But the question is, what do you have to give up to do that? If you have to sell out the pharmaceutical benefits scheme to do that, it wouldn't be worth doing. So, the challenge really is that from our point of view, in terms of AUKUS, where, we are stuck with we could threaten to pull out of AUKUS, but I don't think Albanese's got the stomach for that. But I think that we're kind of stuck with the deal we've done there. In terms of tariffs, we can legitimately say, we have a free trade agreement with you. You have no tariffs and no quotas coming into Australia. You have a big trade surplus. What are you complaining about? But that argument was effective when I was Prime Minister, and I managed to get Australia an exemption from steel and aluminium tariffs, back in Trump 1. That type of argument, the government's tried to rinse and repeat that, but hasn't been successful. I think it'll be hard. I think it'll be very hard. As to what he could get out of it. It's maybe try to get some deal. There's a potential I think that our farmers wouldn't object to the importation of American beef if, in fact, it was beef that had been grown and killed in the United States. I mean, we've actually been ready to accept that for some time. The problem is the Americans want to be able to include in the beef they export beef that has been processed in the United States, but which has come from Mexico and Canada. And so, the concern, of course, is, diseases, foot and mouth in particular. And so, it's one thing for the Americans to say, we've got a very good, system of managing bovine health in the United States. But Mexico, that's a very big country, doesn't have the same levels of control. So at least we can say here in Australia that the beef that is processed in Australian abattoirs is grown in Australia. So, we're much more in control of our own supply chain.
Malcolm, you know all too well that often the detail of those kinds of negotiations, the trade relationship between Australia and the United States and the alliance more broadly, are framed as being based on shared values. You mentioned this at the start of our conversation. The Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, recently described those shared values quite specifically as being democracy and the rule of law. And you pointed out, I think quite rightly, that we don't necessarily share those values with Trump's version of the United States. Despite that, despite the Labor government's apparent adherence to the AUKUS deal or its desire to save the deal, the Prime Minister has given indications that the government is thinking about the relationship differently, you know, that it is aware of the reality of the Trump administration and what it's doing. You know, I'm thinking about his election night speech, for example.
Today, the Australian people have voted for Australian values. We do not need to beg or borrow or copy from anywhere else. We do not seek our inspiration overseas. We find it right here in our values and in our people.
Or his invocation of the idea of progressive patriotism. Given all of that, I suppose, given the detail of the trade relationship, given what Trump is doing to our shared values, and the slight change in the nature of the way the government is talking about the relationship, how do you see the immediate future of the alliance?
Well, look, it's under stress, right? I mean, it is, it's not Australia that's walking away from the US alliance. I mean, the United States is walking away from its allies, and it's not abandoning them. But what it is certainly doing is saying to them, you have got to do more to defend yourselves. You cannot rely on us. In some senses, the message is almost you're on your own, mate. But, you know, the problem that we have is that over the last few years, we've sacrificed a lot of sovereignty. And, you know, this is where, critics of AUKUS say, and of course this is what the French predicted at the time, you know, we sacrificed sovereignty, or the government sacrificed sovereignty to get security, and it actually looks like we're going to lose both. You know, we've certainly lost a lot of sovereignty. And if we end up with no submarines at all, then our security is diminished as well. So I think frankly, we do need a bigger conversation. We really do need a bigger conversation. We've got to stop having these momentous decisions taken by small groups of people in private, which is what happened with AUKUS, whether it was Morrison's decision or indeed the Labor opposition's decision to go along with it in a shadow cabinet meeting on, less than 24 hours notice with no papers. So we've got to stop treating these things like political issues just to, fend off an adverse headline in the Australian or, on Sky News, which is what the people seem to be running scared of most of the time, and actually have a hard-headed, realistic discussion. What is it that we need to defend ourselves? How much can we do ourselves? How much do we need to depend on an ally? And how much do we want to depend on an ally, recognising that allies may not always be reliable, particularly when you're looking forward not 2 or 3 or 4 years, but 10, 20, 30 years. So, I think my message is very clearly, sovereignty is absolutely paramount. We have to be able to defend ourselves, because ultimately the only people we can truly count on are each other, Australians.
On that note, Malcolm, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Great to chat.
If you want to read more about AUKUS and the future of Australia's security, you can order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay. You can purchase After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. If you like the work we do at the Australia Institute, please consider supporting our end of financial year appeal. By donating today, you'll help fund the research changing Australia for the better. All donations over $2 are tax deductible, and you can do so by following the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 16th of June. Some stuff will probably have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.